About 4,000 years ago, an empire stood in the depths of the jungle, counting the stars in the sky without modern telescopes. Their mathematical science was so perfect that even NASA is surprised today. But the question is, after so much knowledge, so much power, and building all the pyramids that touch the sky, where did 10 million people suddenly disappear one day? Why did their calendar predict the destruction of the world in 2012? And their definition of beauty was so terrifying that today's people would shudder to hear it. This Maya civilization was a bloodthirsty god, human sacrifice, and a lost city of gold. How did such a great civilization begin? And how did it suddenly collapse?
The story begins in 1839. This was a time when this part of the world map in the middle of America was considered almost empty. It was believed that it was impossible for humans to live in the deadly jungle here. There was only malaria, poisonous snakes, and death. But the two explorers, John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherode, were not afraid of these dangers. The local natives told them stories of old stone houses that no one believed. They entered the impenetrable jungle of Honduras, where the sunlight did not reach the ground. Unknown dangers awaited them at every step. Week after week, they almost gave up due to fatigue and illness. Then, while clearing the jungle, their axes hit something hard.
When they removed the centuries-old moss and bushes that had accumulated on it, the ground moved away from under their feet. It was no ordinary stone. It was a pillar. On it was something written in an unknown language. When they looked up, it was not the jungle, but a huge stone temple. This was the city of Copan, a city as grand as the pyramids of Egypt, but hidden from the world. This discovery shocked the whole world. It was lost for thousands of years, but one of the most advanced civilizations of its time was the Maya civilization. If we see them in the world today, it spread over the areas of present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. When Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were going on in India, when the cities of Mesopotamia were being built, around 2000 BC, that is 4,000 years ago, this civilization was taking root in this deep jungle on the other side of the world. But until the 19th and 20th centuries, the idea of archaeologists was very limited.
We thought that there were only a few temples in the jungle where people would come and go to worship. We thought that their population was very small. But our idea was wrong, and it took us more than 100 years to correct this mistake. In 2018, science discovered a technology that can see through walls. The technology is called LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging. Scientists flew a LiDAR scanner over the jungle of northern Guatemala. This machine fired billions of laser pulses into the ground. These wires scanned the ground through the gaps between the trees and created a 3D map. When the computer processed the data and removed the trees, the scene that emerged blew the scientists' minds. What we thought was an empty jungle was actually a megalopolis, or a huge metropolis. More than 60,000 buildings were buried there. We estimated that there were several 100,000 people here, but LiDAR proved that the Maya civilization had more than 1 million people. That is, a much larger population than any country in Europe at that time. We were surprised to know this. But then a big question arose before the scientists. When the great civilizations of the world were emerging about 4,000 years ago, they had one thing in common. All those civilizations were established on the banks of rivers. For example, the Indus Valley civilization was located near the Indus and Satluj rivers, and the Mesopotamian civilization was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But the story of the Maya civilization was a bit different.
If you look at the map carefully, there was no river in a large part of their empire. The soil there was made of limestone.
This stone is like a sponge. So the question is, why did 10 million people decide to settle in a place that was no less than a desert, where there was no water for cultivation, where the soil was barren? How did they build buildings that touched the sky? Did they run away and hide in this jungle out of fear? Or did they find some secret technology to defeat nature, which the rest of the world did not have? So let's enter the depths of this jungle. To understand why the Maya settled in that deadly jungle, we have to go back a little further. Not just 4,000 years, but 20,000 years. It was the Ice Age. The whole world was covered in ice. The sea level had dropped so low that the water between Asia and America had frozen. This was the path through which a group of people left Asia in search of prey and entered a new world. This world was America. It was not a country like today's America, but rather a jungle without people. These people kept moving. For thousands of years they kept moving south to escape the cold. They crossed the vast deserts of North America. They crossed the mountains of Mexico.
Whenever it rained, this soil would absorb all the water. The rivers would not flow over the land, but would disappear into the soil. Animals were dying of thirst. Farming was impossible. This jungle was a big deception. So the question is the same. Why didn't these people run away? Why didn't they go back? Because they found the door to the underworld. This underworld is not like your fairy tale. When they were wandering around looking for water, they saw a deep hole in the ground in the middle of the jungle. When they peered in, something like darkness was shining down. It was water, sweet, clear, and endless water. These are called cenotes because the ground above was made of limestone. So in places, underground rivers flowed down through the collapse. To the Maya, this wasn't just a well. To them, this was the door to the underworld. They believed that Chak, the rain god, lived inside this cave. And that was what kept them trapped in this jungle. Where the whole world was settling on the banks of rivers, the Maya people began to settle around these magical wells. Water was available, but war was still to come. The jungle was so dense that it was impossible to clear it without iron, so they resorted to fire. They burned small sections of the forest, and they used the ashes as fertilizer. This was where their greatest discovery, the corn, began. This pollutant was so powerful that it caused their population to explode. But how? We'll see later. Now they were no longer slaves. Now they owned the forest.
They had water. They had food. But there was one thing they didn't have. That was iron. People on the other side of the world were making weapons and palaces out of iron and bronze. But the Maya had only stone. So far, we've seen that the Maya had solved the water problem. But they had another challenge, bigger than water. They had to build cities in the middle of the forest, build temples and erect pyramids for their gods. But here was a huge problem. The great buildings of the whole world were being built with iron chisels and hammers. The Egyptians were using copper or bronze. But the Maya people did not have a single piece of metal. Not iron, not copper, not steel. They did not even have a wheel. No, they had horses or oxen that could pull heavy stones. So think about how they cut millions of tons of stone and lifted it hundreds of feet high without iron tools, cranes, trucks, and animals. This is the greatest miracle in the world of engineering. First of all, let's talk about their tools. If they didn't have iron, how did they cut stones? The answer is with another stone. It's called obsidian. It's a kind of black glass that comes out of volcanoes. When it's broken, its edge is sharp.
They used the round trunk of a tree as a roller and started pulling the stones with the help of ropes. But the pulling process was very painful. They tied the ropes around their foreheads instead of around their shoulders. It was called a mekapal. They used their necks to pull heavier and heavier stones. It wasn't just architecture, it was human ingenuity. But their greatest invention was Mayan cement. They burned limestone into a powder that hardened like a mortar when mixed with water. The ruins we see today are grey, but at that time the entire city was covered in red and white plaster. It was so strong that even 1,000 years of rain couldn't completely wash it away. And when they built buildings with this stone, they didn't just build houses, they built talking palaces. Yes, you heard that right. If you clap your hands in front of the pyramids of Chichen Itza, the sound echoes back. But that sound is not the sound of clapping. That sound sounds like the chirping of a bird. Scientists were amazed how this is possible. Later it was found out that they deliberately built the steps of the pyramid at an angle that transformed the sound into the sound of their sacred bird, the quet. Imagine that. Today, sound engineers would need high-tech computers to do this, but the Mayans did it with just stones. The Egyptian pyramids were tombs where kings were buried, but the Mayan pyramids were not just tombs. They also used them to count the time of year. For example, the Pyramid of El Castillo was not built just for its height. It was actually a huge calendar made of stone. It has 91 steps around it, and a total of 365 steps, including the upper platform.
That is, each day of the year is equal to 1 step. But its real magic is seen only twice a year. When day and night are equal, the sunlight falls on the steps of the pyramid in such a way that the shadow takes the shape of a snake. It seems as if a huge snake is crawling from the sky to the ground. This was no coincidence. For this, it was necessary for them to know at what degree the sun would rise and at what degree it would set for thousands of years. This means that the Mayans were not just workers or craftsmen. They were mathematicians. There were scientists with them. Without any telescopes or computers, they had made calculations of the sky that even today's NASA scientists accept as perfect. In fact, what kind of mathematics did they have? How did they discover zero before the world? And why did their calendar predict the destruction of the world in 2012? Think of a strange thing. If you were to go to Europe 1,500 years ago, the people there were stuck in Roman numerals. Doing numbers there was a headache. But at that...
Why? Because their thinking was primitive. They included not only the 10 fingers on their hands, but also the 10 toes on their feet in their calculations. Their mathematics was so simple that even an illiterate person could understand it. A dot meant 1, a spot meant 5, and a number-like symbol meant 0. The Mayans did not just live on the ground. Their gaze was always on the stars. They measured the movements of the planets without any telescopes or glass lenses. Their favorite planet was Venus. They did not consider it a planet of love. They considered it a god of war. They could tell the time of the rising and setting of Venus so accurately that there was only a few seconds difference. Imagine how such accurate calculations were possible with the naked eye. They built observatories like El Caracol. If you see this building today, it looks like any modern temple, with windows made in the dome to see the stars. And from this science, the Mayan calendar was born. You must have heard about the rumor that the world would end in 2012. That was a prediction of the Mayan calendar. But the truth is that their calendar wasn't for world destruction. They didn't see time as a straight line like we do, so 2023 is gone and 2024 is here. And the old years were lost forever. They thought of time as a circle or cycle. They believed that history repeats itself. What happened today will happen again in 1,000 years. With this thought in mind, they created a calendar that was not 10 or 100 years. Rather, it was a great cycle of 5,125 years. They called it the Long Count. The world thought the end of the calendar meant the end of the world. But for the Mayan people,
It was just a clock reset. When the Mayan civilization was so advanced, what was the life of the people there like, and what were their customs like? Now we will take our eyes off those great pyramids and the world of stars, and come down to Earth. History mostly talks about kings, but what was the life of an ordinary person living in that jungle like? Was he happy, or was he just a slave? The truth is that the difference between rich and poor in Maya society was so deep that it may not be even today. Society was clearly divided into two groups. At the top were the kings and the elite. They lived in stone palaces in the middle of the city. They wore jaguar skins, and on their heads were the expensive feathers of the quetzal bird. On the other hand, there were ordinary people. Although the kings lived in stone palaces, the common people, that is, farmers and craftsmen, lived in airy houses made of clay and wood. Exactly like our current huts, which had roofs so that the house remained cool even in summer.
The surprising thing is that they believed in joint families. There were many houses in the same courtyard. Grandparents, uncles, and aunts all lived nearby. In the evening, after work, the whole family would sit in the courtyard and talk. This was their social life. The heart of every home was the kitchen. And the food of the Maya people was very similar to our bread. They made more corn flour and made tortillas with it, which was exactly like our corn bread. With it they ate beans, kidney beans, pumpkin, and chili chutney. Yes, chili. The Maya people loved to eat spicy food, whether it was breakfast or dinner. The whole family would sit on the ground and eat together. But what was the role of women in this society? History often forgets women, but in the Maya civilization, women were a silent force. They didn't just manage the house, they were the backbone of the economy. Weaving clothes, making pottery, and running the market were all in the hands of women. And you will be surprised to know that in Maya history, some women even became queens and sat on the throne, like Lady Six Sky, a queen who not only ruled, but also licked the dust of enemies on the battlefield. That is, the women there were gentle and, when necessary, warriors. But if you met a person from that time face to face, you might be scared.
Because their beauty standards were completely different and terrible than ours. Today we wear nice clothes to look beautiful, but the Maya people would change their bodies forever to look beautiful, so that the curve of the child's forehead towards the back becomes longer. To us this may seem painful, but to them it was like looking like a camel god. The longer the head, the more beautiful it is. Another strange beauty standard was to polish their teeth with a file and insert expensive green stone jets. This was a symbol of nobility. Imagine having your teeth drilled without a doctor or anesthetic. This wasn't just fashion, it was a test of endurance. And now let me tell you something interesting. That is money. There, coins were not used to buy things in the market. Money actually grew on trees. Their currency was cocoa beans or chocolate seeds. It took 10 beans to buy a rabbit and 100 beans to buy a slave. And the kings didn't spend this money. They drank their money. Even drinking chocolate-flavored water was the right of the rich. From above, this society seemed very organized and colorful, but inside every civilization, a whole system worked. This entire jungle was divided into different city-states, such as Tikal, Kalakamul, Copan, and Palenque. Each city was a separate country within itself, and each city had its own kingdom. And this king was not an ordinary man. They called him a Kuhul Ajau, that is, a divine king. The Projas believed that kings were not human beings, but
People believed that if the king was happy, it would rain, and if the king was weak, the sun would stop rising. This was the reason why these cities were never at peace among themselves. There were always wars between them. But their wars were less about taking land and more about taking prisoners, so that the gods could be pleased by sacrificing those prisoners. And the most surprising thing
was that they did not make war decisions on their own. They would attack by looking at the sky. They would bring out their armies when the planet Venus was in a certain position in the sky. Archaeologists called it Star Wars. But the way they designed their cities is a huge lesson for today's architects. Look at their urban planning. You must remember that I said that if there were no rivers, then how would a city of 1 million people get water? Look at their intelligence here. They turned their entire city into a huge reservoir. When it rained, the water would come down from the pyramids. Their large plazas and courtyards were deliberately sloped. With the help of gravity, every drop of water in the city flowed through the canals and was stored in a huge reservoir or reservoir in Tikal. The city had so much water that even if it didn't rain for 18 months, people wouldn't die of thirst. And this water wasn't dirty. They installed filters.
Each pyramid was painted in red, blue, and yellow. There was no silence in the streets. There was music. The sound of conch shells, wooden drums, and flutes always floated in the air. Their festivals were no less than a carnival. Thousands of people would gather. King peacocks and macaws would dance wearing colourful feathers. This dance was not just for fun. It was a worship to please the gods. They were crazy about art. Be it carvings on walls or paintings on clay pots, everything had a story. But to run such a big city, such grand festivals, and the hunger of millions of people, one thing was needed that was more important than war and water. That was food and money. Where did the food come from in the jungle for such a huge population? And how did their economy work? Did they only eat corn, or did they have some super crop that made them rich? Friends, building pyramids is difficult, but an even harder task is to feed 1 million people. As I said before, the soil in the jungle is very weak for cultivation. If you cut down trees and cultivate there, the soil will become barren within 2 or 3 years. So how did the Maya people feed such a huge population? The markets were the lifeblood of their cities. The market of Tikal was so big that 20 to 25,000 people would gather there every day. The noise, the aroma of spices, and the flash of colours would drive anyone crazy. They had everything. A wonderful system, endless money, the most perfect calendar in the world, and buildings that reached the sky. This civilization was in its golden age. Until about 900 AD, it seemed that this empire would never end. But friends, history is a witness that when a civilization is at the peak of its development, its fall is just a matter of a few steps. Such an incident happened with the Maya. In 900 AD, the Maya civilization slowly reached its peak. The cities were crowded with millions of people. The pyramids were brightly coloured, and the kings were intoxicated with their power. But then, suddenly, silence descended. In just 100 years, the world's largest cities became uninhabited. Palaces were no longer inhabited by kings, but by bats. The calendar that predicted the future for thousands of years suddenly stopped. For historians, this is the world's biggest murder mystery. What actually happened that made 10 million people flee their homes? There was no single reason behind it. It was a domino effect. The first reason was their own mistakes. Environmental suicide. You must remember that I told you at the beginning that they used limestone to plaster the pyramids. They had to cut down thousands of acres of forest just to paint one pyramid.
They cut down that forest to decorate their cities. It gave them breath and rain. And when there were no trees, the clouds turned away. Scientists have found evidence under the Chankana River that there was a great famine or drought at that time. It was not a 1 or 2 year drought. It lasted for 100 years. The rain decreased by 50% to 70%. The reservoirs dried up
and the rivers disappeared. The second reason was population explosion, or overpopulation. The Maya people became victims of their own success. The forests were shrinking, but there were millions of mouths to feed. They squeezed the land for cultivation so much that the soil became infertile. Now they had neither forests nor fields. The third reason was epidemics or diseases. When the drought came, people were forced to drink dirty water. Malnutrition spread, and when diseases broke out in the densely populated cities, they spread like wildfire. Thousands of people began to die overnight. The fourth and last reason was civil war. Hunger turned people into animals. The subjects who considered their king a god now took up arms against the king, because the king had promised to bring rain, but he failed. Civil wars broke out between the cities.
And this Maya civilization fell asleep in the pages of history until it was rediscovered in 1839. This was the story of a civilization that was lost in the jungle.